This is Dateline News and Conversation. My guest tonight is a good friend. He's been on the show, but quite a while ago. So we're going to introduce him to you again tonight. Ron Ridenour. He's an accomplished author. He's written several books. He's a journalist and he's a peace activist. Ron, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here.
So, Ron, before we get into the nitty gritty and politics and what's going on in the EU, uh, tell us a little bit about your background. It's fascinating.
No, okay. Um, well, I was born in 86 years ago in a couple of days in the United States of fucking America, which I called the United States of America Racist Military Empire. Uh, my father was a military man, was in the Second World War and remained in it until he retired. Um, I grew up in New Jersey, Oklahoma, and when um, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in 1956, I had just been turned 17, and I was a senior in high school. And my father and I heard about it on the radio news, and I joined the Air Force, which he was in, to fight commies. And I was sent to a training school in Mississippi. And in my free time, I was learning radar operator, and I played tennis. And my doubles partner was a black guy. And when I first passed, we walked into town or took a bus into town. I can't remember. At any rate, we were kicked out of town because he was black and I was white. And when we got back to the base, the commander called us in and cautioned us, sanctioned us because we should have not uh, been together, in Mississippi. So basically, I began to wake up. I was a military brat, and I began to wake up because of racism. I think I should mention the first thing in my life that I recalled later was I was in New York City, rather New Jersey, Newark, New Jersey, when I was 6, playing Cowboys and Indians on the sofa uh, the armchair, and I heard a real shot, and I went over to the window, and lying on the sidewalk was a black guy about my age with blood pumping out of his back, and a cop, white cops, in blue uniform with his pistol. My grandfather said later on that the radio said that the cop saw him steal an apple from an outdoor kiosk, and he shouted to him to stop, but the kid ran. So, of course, he had to shoot him. He said he shot up in the air, but somehow or another, there's a lot of smog in New York, Newark, New Jersey, and the bullet hit him in the back. When I was in the barracks, when I was in Japan in the military, I went to a local bar, Japanese bar, of course, which was for where the black GIs were to be. The white GIs were to be in another bar. When I came back to the barracks, the the people in the barracks, there were 20 of us. 4 of them took me into the snow naked, then put me on top of a bunk bed and burnt off my hairs around my penis to teach me not to fraternize with the black people. The barracks were separated. There were blacks in some and whites in others. So this motivated me that when I got out of the military, I joined what was just then the budding 60s movement, the youth movement, which I wish was happening today and which was the best time in my life. I spent time in prison fighting racism, fighting the Vietnam War. I was in Mississippi in 1964 when three of us were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan and the cops. And our project, I was like an administrator, kept the records and helped people in freedom schools and stuff. At any rate, I left the United States in 1980 and came to Denmark, married a woman here. And during these years since then, in 1980, I've spent about 10 years in Nicaragua and Cuba. Cuba invited me to come to write about their double agents in 1987, 88. 27 of them were called out because of internal, um, because the CIA was about to discover them. So I wrote the first book about that. It's called Backfire, the CIA's Biggest Burn. And the Communist Party of Cuba and the government, basically considered me pretty much like the Russian people consider you, a hero for the revolution. And I had, 8 marvelous years there. Came back to Denmark to try to save my marriage at the time, and it didn't work. So now, many years later, I'm with another woman. We've been together 12 years, and Jetta has a disease. And so I'm pretty much out of action now, but I was in activities, anti-war activities in Denmark until this war started, and nobody in Denmark is supporting Russia. There are quite a few people supporting Palestine, but Russia is verboten. And this is a great, you know, tragedy for me that I don't have anybody to work with. So that's my background.
Uh, Tell me a little bit more about your time in Nicaragua. What were you doing down there?
Well, I worked for the vice president, who's the vice president now, Rosario Murillo. She was the executive director of the Sandinista Cultural Organization, and they invited me to come to be their PR director. And I did that. We were in the war zones, and I was given a weapon by the army to protect. We were, a group of actors. I wasn't an actor. I was, public relations, but I was accompanying actors in the war zone, and and the army gave me a weapon and a couple of other weapons, and when we entered this town where we were to perform, it was being attacked by the Contras and the Ronald Reagan Contras, and he called them as great as the founding fathers of the United States. And they have been among the most brutal of counter-revolutionaries in history. Well, at any rate, I joined the army. I was on the army truck, and the two representatives from the government that I was working for that were with me said I had to get off the truck or their leader, Rosario Murillo, would fire me or something like that. So anyway, I got off the truck and she fired me anyway because I guess she didn't want me being killed, and being a U.S. citizen, it would create some kind of scandal. So we fell out of favor with one another. But I came back the next year with about 300 people from the Europe. I was one of three spokesperson for an international um, march from Panama to Mexico, supporting the what was called the Contadora effort to stop the wars that the U.S. was supporting in Guatemala, El Salvador, and against Nicaragua. And I was there, for 6 weeks, and I stayed on to end. I ended up writing my first book, which was about Nicaragua. It's called Sandinistas, Yankee Sandinistas, Interviews with North Americans. So I've written 13 books since then, and that was that.
Well, all right. Thanks for that introduction, Ron. I wanted people to either remember you if they saw you in previous shows, or for anybody that's new to the show, uh, to understand who you are. Now, you mentioned a couple of things, and this is what I want to start off with tonight, the nitty gritty. Uh, why in the world, first of all, did you move to Denmark back in the 80s?
Well, because I met a Danish woman um, who was on vacation, and it was the end of the our 60s and 70s. The youth were getting older, and at that point there was no wars. Reagan was about to be president, but there was a lull in wars, and I had a wife then and two children, but she took them from me in a court case, to stop joint custody. And I had a 1 day visit a week, a one no a few hours a week, and every other weekend for 24 hours or something. It was a terrible separation, and she would have prevented any possibility for me to live there with another woman. So when Greta, I met this Danish woman's named Greta. When we decided to get married, we had a choice to live either in the United States or in Denmark. And I chose to live in Denmark. The children at that time were 10 years old, and I wrote them and tried to call, but their mother never let me talk to them and never gave them letters. And so I didn't get to see them. And then when I was in Cuba, when the United States invaded Iraq the first time in 1991, I burnt my U.S. passport before the U.S. Office of Interest, and it went around the world. It was CNN news, and the children I had were in college. And when I got to ring them to talk to them, it was just after this burning of the passport, and they told me they never wanted to see me again, that I was a traitor to the United States of America, the United States racist military empire. So they went the Zionist way. I hope we've never communicated since then. I can only hope that they're not supporting Zionist, fascist Israel, but I don't know that they're not. So that's why I stayed in Denmark and with 10 years in Nicaragua and Cuba, and never went back to the US other than a visit,
Yeah. Um, well, that's quite a story. All right. Now we've established that you're in Denmark. Uh, like, what have you been doing the last few years? I know you've been taking care of your partner, Jetta, but have you been working or have you been retired all these years?
Well, I've been retired for 20 years now, so my income is okay. I live on a half pension here and a half pension in the United States, which is a full pension in Denmark. And it's just enough money for me to survive okay. And now that I'm not able to be an activist, I send donations. I send a lot of money for Julian Assange, and now I send donations to people like you and others who are fighting Zionism and the Yankees in Ukraine. So before these 3 years, with Jetta's sickness, dement, uh, there were some activities that I could join, and I wrote here and I was an activist, but I can't be now because I have to be with her full time. But Denmark, if we want to talk about what Denmark is all about in this war,
Yeah, I do. I do.
okay,
That's probably the main reason that we're doing
yeah,
this show tonight. I want to know, what the buzz is in Denmark.
yeah. Well, Denmark. you know, joined the Nazis in the Second World War. I mean, it was only the Communist Party that fought the Nazis, and they wouldn't have got the Marshall Plan had the Communist Party not been quite effective in sabotage. Um, the Denmark's government was a social democrat government, like the current one, like the Democrats in the United States, like Woodrow Wilson, went to World War I and sent, basically sent Julian Assange in prison already then with the Espionage Act. Fuck these Democrats. Nobody of any morality sense, whether they call themselves progressives or not, should ever vote for the Democratic Party or the Social Democrats in Europe. The Social Democrats in Europe today are just as bad as the far right wing or the right wing supporting Ukraine. Un Weirdly enough, some of the far right wing in Europe actually doesn't want the war in Ukraine. It's very crazy in Europe today. The politics in Denmark is basically always been a supporter of the U.S. because they were afraid they wouldn't get the Marshall Plan. And when they did, they just went overboard in supporting all of the U.S. wars since 1991. And one of their prime ministers, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, became NATO chief. And then the next chief was the Norway prime minister. Um, and the current chief, Social Democrat Mette Frederiksen, was up for NATO chief, but Biden decided it had to be somebody else than from the Scandinavia. But today, the Scandinavian countries, with Denmark in the lead, are among the worst of the Ukraine fascists. They Denmark spends per capita more money than any other country in the world. They have 6 million people here. And I'll just have to read some of this because I can't remember all of the figures. But I just did some more new research. They have spent $12 billion on the Ukraine war for a population of 6 million. That is $2,000 per person. And that is the equivalent of 4 years of its military defense budget, which was $3 billion a year last year. Now they're increasing that. They're coming up to 4 and then 5% of GNP to please Biden, to please Trump. Now, this figures that I've just given you is the fourth greatest figures of all the countries, the 57 countries supporting the war with around $1 trillion. The United States, according to their own foreign Secretary of State, whatever you call it, no, the military has spent $184 billion. That is only $410 per person. That's to say that per person, Denmark is spending about 5 times what U.S. citizens are spending. Now, none of this gets ever reported in all of the media, the mass media, or all of the good alternative media that I read. And I want to encourage you and President Putin to talk about this. I want I want the world to know that Scandinavia is just as evil as the so-called Labour Party in London and the so-called, and the German neo-Nazi government and the French government. And it was also Norway that Navy, along with the CIA, the U.S. Navy and the CIA, that did the Nord Stream sabotage, supported by Norway, or rather Sweden and Denmark, because the area that was bombed is in the so-called economic territory of Sweden and Denmark. And they do not allow international investigations of that sabotage, nor even Russia is allowed to come there and see what happened. Now, that sabotage was the greatest pollution to the air and sea in the history of polluting. Denmark is a part of that, as I just said. The German world economy um, and the World Economy Kiel Institute shows that 41 of 57 nation donors have spent $335 billion. Oh, well, I don't need to get into that. Denmark was one of 12 countries that started NATO. 19,000 new buildings were related to NATO were built before 1991 when the idiot Gorbachev, so almost a one-man dictator, stopped the Soviet Union's existence, which was the greatest error that Russia has ever made. And we are being constantly bombarded that the Russians are coming. We must hoard rations, water, and food for 3 to 5 days when the Russians invade. Uh, as as the Defense Intelligence Agency in this country contends, they are bombarding us with this notion that after Russia wins, if they win in Ukraine, they will then invade a neighboring country of Russia within 6 months. Then within 2 years, they will invade a, a European NATO country to test out what happens. And then within 5 years, they will invade all of Europe. Now, I mean, just saying this drives me crazy because they give absolutely no evidence. The only thing they say is that Russia is increasing its arms production. Well, of course, they're increasing their arms production because they're at war with fascist Ukraine and NATO, because NATO indirectly is indirectly, that is to say, directly with arms, spending about $1 trillion at this point in all figures that I can find. So we're talking about um, brainwashing to the extent that I don't know anybody. I don't know any group, no political party. There are five so-called communist and Trotskyist parties in this country. None of them support Russia. It is forbidden to even instruct in schools what the Russians say, why they're doing this. When one professor did so about 2 years ago, he was fired and he said, I do not support the SMO, the Special Military Operations, but I want to tell my classes. He's written 5 books on Ukraine and 3 books on Ukraine and Russia. And he was a professor for many years, and he was teaching his class that was on Ukraine, that, among other things, what Russia says they're doing. One person in that class reported him to the university, and they fired him. Then he was put on the CIA shit list. What do they call that? The Ukraine has a website where they put people's names on it that they consider enemies of Ukraine, and some of them have been killed. The name of that escapes me right now. But when I was writing, I wrote in my last years mainly for the Covert Action magazine. And their editor-in-chief, Jeremy Kuzmarov, is on that list. Well, they put this man, a Danish professor, on this list. In this September, uh, the Danish government, September 3rd, the day before the coalition of the willing met in Paris, the first meeting, the pre-Paris meeting, was in the Marienborg, which is where the prime minister's housing is, and there was a ceremony for the five Scandinavian countries and the three Baltic countries, part of the coalition of the willing. And there they adopted spending jointly $5 million, 500 million more dollars on the war. That's a part of the $2,000 per person I was telling you about. And then the next day, they all went to Paris, where they started, where they, sent more weapons. They agreed to send more weaponry. Then September 9th, um, some missiles, some drones were sent over to Ukraine and got off course and went into Poland. Now, the media here reported this as though the drones were armed and as though Russia had sent them, uh, on purpose to Poland. But what they didn't tell anybody that was watching or reading their papers was that Belarus's general, the secretary, the military chief of Belarus went on TV and video, anybody can see it, and announced that they saw these drones coming. They stopped some of them, and they warned both Poland and Lithuania that they might come into their territory. The mass media in this country did not even report that fact. So I'm telling you this to try to impress upon you and your readers that they've got to start thinking that Bernie Sanders' favorite so-called socialist government, which he called Denmark, this idiot, is far from being socialist. It is as capitalist as any right-wing capitalist government can think to be. And the Finns are just as bad. And the Finns have thousands of troops alongside U.S. troops facing Russian troops at the 1,500-kilometer borderline, and it's one of six countries in NATO now bordering the 14 countries, bordering Russia of the 14 countries. And if Ukraine came in, it would be number seven. So there's no way in hell that Russia is going to allow Ukraine to be in NATO.
Hey, Ron, I want to slowly rewind a number of things you mentioned. That Ukrainian kill list is called Mirat Vorets.
Yeah,
Mirat Vorets.
good.
And these are all people that the Nazi government in Kiev have identified as being against Ukraine, either writing about it, talking about it, actively intervening in some way or other.
Right.
And it's an assassination list. They have assassinated a number of people, high-ranking
Right.
Russian military officials, political officials, civilians, journalists. They're picking them off one by one.
Yeah.
Their favorite weapon is car bombs. Um, anyway, uh, I was very interested to hear your comments on how freaking insane the Europeans are, the Danish, the Finns, the Swedes, those absolutely silly chihuahuas in the Baltic countries, thinking and preparing for war because they think that Russia is going to invade. There's an expression in Latin. It's si vis pacem para bellum. It's translated to be if you want peace, prepare for war.
Yeah.
I think that's bullshit.
Yeah.
I use the phrase si vis bellum para bellum. If you want war, prepare for war. And that's what these absolutely insane European EU leaders are doing. And I knew this, but I was so happy to hear you say this because the people listening to this in the United States need to understand what the heck is going on. You folks were told not only to prepare for war psychologically, to hoard food, water, and supplies. Ron, I think it was for just like 4 or 5 days. Are they
Yeah,
freaking out of their minds? If there's going to be a war, 4 or 5 days of food, water, and supplies, it's just not going to hack it. I mean, it's totally insane that these people are believing this stuff. I can't
yeah,
believe that the majority of people, at least in most of the countries in Europe and in NATO, I cannot believe the people are putting up with it. Well, we're seeing that they're not in the UK, in France, in Germany right now, but especially UK and France, massive protests against the governments. And this Merz guy in Germany, his popularity is so low that there are demonstrations now against him. Um, this is really, really frightening that the war, the rhetoric for war, the rhetoric, the belligerent rhetoric, unfounded against Moscow, against Putin,
yeah.
because he unjustifiably invaded Ukraine. You and I both know that's a crock. He was provoked. Russia was provoked. The 2014 coup d'etat in Kiev, orchestrated, organized, funded by the United States of America in the person of Hillary Clinton's deputy, Victoria Nuland, and the current ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt. It's all on YouTube. There's no denying this.
Right.
And what Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt decided before the actual toppling of the government was who was going to be the next president.
Three
Yes.
weeks before, they named the
Yeah,
three leaders, right? And one of them then started the Azov Battalion.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so this has all been the most evil form of lies and propaganda that basically the United States has saturated 99% of the people in America. There's supposedly 340 million people. I don't know that there's a million people in America that really are awake and know what the hell is going on. All of these leaders across the EU, handpicked and groomed because they're stupid people with no historical background, no knowledge of history, and no experience in diplomacy. You look across the board, they all fit that profile. So, Ron, I got to ask you this. Given what we've been talking about and all of this belligerent rhetoric preparing for war, do you think it might actually happen?
Well, I think I think it's certainly a possibility, but there's also a possibility that it won't because in Spain, Jetta and I have been in Spain many times now, and we can't any longer, but we spent quite a bit of time in Spain, um, and there was this cycle competition in Spain recently, the other day, and there were tens of thousands of people protesting. They actually stopped the final event from being celebrated. It was a Dane for the first time in this conference competition that won this race, but they couldn't celebrate it, and they wanted, the protest was against that Israel participated. Now the president, the statesman, the prime minister of Spain is a so-called socialist, like a social democrat. While he said that the race, should not have been was the race was actually not stopped by these demonstrators, but it maybe frightened some cyclists. At any rate, he supported the demonstrators. I was I was actually surprised that he did. And when the mass media in Denmark talked about this, they said, well, he was influenced because there's a lot of influence from Arabic countries in Spain, of course. Now, there are also a lot of Germans and a lot of Frenchmen that are opposed to this war. And I think that if Russia can win fairly quickly, hopefully, not another year or more, I think it's quite possible that much of the citizenry of Europe, which is already getting fed up with it, will be all the more fed up with this war. And I think that it will be difficult for the leadership that we have now to actually perform a war. And also, I say this because the current leadership in most of the European governments have been there for quite a while. Now, the one in Germany and the one in England are new, but in Scandinavia, it's basically the same governments, the same parties, and they've put their prestige on the line for Ukraine. The figures I gave you, when the Danish people can know, some people know what I just said about some of the figures. They're actually spending more money to fight Russia in Ukraine than they're spending on their own national defense. Now they're increasing their national defense figures to meet Trump's, 10%, 5%, but they've put everything online, and they've stopped discourse. I mean, they're ruling out a democratic. I can't debate anywhere. I used to be in the Danish media. I could get into the Danish media. I can't write anything that says anything positive about Russia. And I gave up trying. Not even letters to the editors. I mean, it's atrocious, and nobody gets to know what Russia has suffered by Western governments. I think we're going to get into that now soon. What did what was the United States and England prepared to do at the end of Second World War? They were prepared to invade with atomic weapons. You know, Russia. Can we get into this now?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. If we need a transition, but I think, time is running out perhaps, and I think it's very important to say to your readers some things that they know, of course, about, history, that, the Swedes invade Russia in the early 1700s. They part of the Northern War. And then there was Russia took over Crimean, in 1783, and ended slavery because the Ottoman Empire, had slaves in Crimean, and they basically have had Crimean since then. Also under the Soviet Union, though Khrushchev, uh, who came from Ukrainian, uh, gave, let's say, Ukrainian to. I mean, it was a Soviet, but he also made it. He let Ukrainian have it as a republic, and then after the 1991 catastrophe of ending the Soviet Union, um, Ukrainian had their own government with the CIA, and since 1991, the CIA has been preparing Ukraine for what's happening today. For what happened in 2014. Um, back to the Napoleon invaded Russia, and Russia defeated him in 1812. There was another Crimean War in 1853 to 56, um, which Russia lost more than not, but they got to maintain Crimean. Um, Now I want to get into um, what happened in 1917. Um, with the October Revolution, the peaceful revolution. About a handful of people died in that 7 days. It was peace, land, and bread, led by quite popular leadership of Lenin and Trotsky. Trotsky was put in charge of starting the Red Army. The Tsar's army, the White Army, started a war as soon, right after the revolution began. They had within a few months up to a million troops, well armed. The Red Army started with around 300,000 and grew to 800,000. But what happened was that Woodrow Wilson declared war against Russia. They were in war already against Germany, and he organized, along with UK, 16 countries from Europe and Turkey and Japan to invade Russia. 300,000 foreign troops, 70,000 from Japan, 13,000 from the US, 40,000 from the UK, 50,000 from Romania to fight the Red Army. The Red Army bravely won the war in 1925. And then we go, you know, with, you know, the whole West opposing, the existence of the communist regime until the Second World War. But what happened at the end of the Second World War that nobody talks about? And I really urge President Putin, through this channel and whatever forces you can muster yourself to talk about that. I don't, maybe he has, but of the speeches I know about, I've never seen this talked about. Before the last shot was fired, Churchill thought he was going to be elected again in July of 45. He began to organize what was called Operation Unthinkable. His plan was to, in July, invade Moscow, three cities. Let me see. There was Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kiev in July of 45. But he wanted atomic weapons. So he talked to Truman. Truman said, I've only got enough for Nicaragua, for Japan. So, we have to wait. Well, uh, he plans to do it in July if Truman could come up with a couple more bombs. But what he didn't expect happened July 5th. The Labor Party, then it was a real Labor Party, and Clement Attlee won. And Attlee decided to have peace with Russia. So Churchill didn't want to give up. He went to join Truman in his home state in March of 46. And while he was with Truman, he convinced Truman to start the first nuclear bomb operation against um, Russia. On March 2nd, 1946, Truman started what was called Operation Pincher, and they were going to build 294 atomic weapons to drop in the Soviet Union. 3 days later, Churchill spoke in Missouri's Westminster College with Truman by his side when he declared the Cold War, the Iron Curtain speech, the Cold War. Now, unbeknownst to anybody, uh, publicly, of course, the U.S. government and Army was building these weapons. And in the next couple of years, they made several other um, uh, plans. Um, Let me look at my notes here. Now, first, let me talk about Yalta. Yeah. Um, going back to Yalta, where you born, you are July 16th, July 17th to August 2nd. Attlee was there, and Stalin and Truman. Uh, Truman let Stalin know that something big was going to be happening soon.
I think that was in
Stalin
Pots.
already
I
knew.
think, Ron, I think that was in Potsdam.
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry, Potsdam. Yeah, yeah. I mentioned Yalta. That was in February because Stalin in Yalta promised Roosevelt that when Europe won, when they won the battle, the war in Europe, he would send troops to help him in Japan. So, as Truman was preparing to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Stalin knew about it because Ted Hall and Klaus Fuchs, Ted Hall, a young American physicist, and Klaus Fuchs, a a German in the Manhattan Project, a German but with U.S. and UK, they sent their information about the plutonium bomb to the Soviets, and the Soviets were able to build their first bomb with those plans in 1949. Now, that was not known by the United States, of course. So Russia sent 1.5 million troops to Manchuria, Japan, as as Truman was bombing Nagasaki, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan was in peace negotiations at that point, and they then surrendered in August 15th, due both to the 1.5 million troops that quickly defeated 700,000 Japanese troops in Manchuria, and of course, the two bombs convinced the Japanese to stop. So now to backing up to the building of atomic weaponry to invade uh, Russia in the Soviet Union. The major plan, there were several names in 46, 47, 48, but in 1949, Truman started Drop Shot. It called for 400 atomic bombs to be dropped upon 200 Soviet targets in 100 Soviet cities. At that point, um, the U.S. government thought that they could do this by 1957, if not before. They had not anticipated that the Soviets would have nuclear weaponry. The Truman started the CIA in 47 and started NATO in April of 49. And they would have taken over all of the Soviet Union after dropping these bombs. Plus they would drop bacteriological chemical warfare from aircraft, as they've done in Cuba, which is another, you know, book of mine. Um, but they would have killed human beings, plants, and animals with chemical biological warfare and with 400 atomic bombs. They would have then sent in hundreds of thousands of troops and from Europe and the United States, and they would have then owned all of what was then the Soviet 15 republics of whatever was left from 200 million people. Now that information should should in of itself be able to convince billions of people that Russia has always been the victim, not the aggressor, and that every Russian knows what I just got through saying, I would imagine. I would imagine that what I just got through saying is taught in Russian schools. Would be interesting to know if they don't or do. But at any rate, this is part of the history of Western aggression and and Ottoman Empire aggression against the Russian people for centuries. And if you want to know more about this story, I refer you to read my colleague Dave Lindorf's book, The Spy for No Country: The Story of Ted Hall, the Teenage Atomic Spy Who May Have Saved the World. Came out in 2023, and he also co-produced a documentary film called A Compassionate Spy that tells about how the Soviet Union was to be attacked by the United States with these with this information I just gave you, and 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 uh, and uh, after Truman had to stop uh, these invasion plans because the Soviets got their bomb, he continued, along with all other presidents since then, to do everything other than that during the so-called Cold War, which would have been very hot. And yeah, that's
Yeah, well,
that's
Ron, I appreciate that historical context. It is important. I can tell you that most Russians know that. They've learned it in school, uh, or they've even
good.
learned it through conversation, through oral tradition. And you mentioned through all of this, Russia, uh, and now even the Soviet Union, with the exception of, invading uh, the parts of Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc. But since the Russian Federation uh, began in the year 2000, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 2000 is when Putin took over, the Russian Federation has not been aggressive, has not attacked anybody. And so it's important to understand that in a historical context. Now, what I'm going to conclude with, Ron, and I know you agree with me, I think humanity owes Vladimir Putin not only a debt of extreme gratitude
Mhm.
because they're still alive. With all of the aggression from the United States of America, from the UK, especially those two countries, they've been in a direct war. It's not a proxy war with Russia since 2014. They orchestrated it all. And what they've done is they continue and have continued to cross all of Russia's red lines, including sending those Storm Shadow and other missiles deep into Russia, including here in Crimea. Putin has shown extreme patience and tolerance, realizing that they're trying to provoke him into some kind of insane reaction that'll bring all of them into a war, which Putin knows will be nuclear, from which nobody survives. I want to end it on that note, Ron. I can't thank you enough for providing some insight into the insanity, not only of the Scandinavian countries, but the rest of the EU in preparing their citizens for war. And I will say this, I think Russia knows that war with the EU is coming. And I assure you that with Russia's military gains that are taking place right now with Belarus in the Baltics and in the Arctic, showcasing most of their brand new weapons and aircraft and ships so that the United States of America will sober up and realize there will be no contest in any war with Russia anytime soon. Ron, thanks so much for coming back on the show. We'll look forward to doing it again to keep up with what's happening in Denmark and the Scandinavian countries.
Yeah. Okay, brother. Right on.